Hello again. We're going to continue on talking about bone development part 2 here, where we will move into endochondral ossification. So endochondral, again, that means, oops, didn't turn my pen on. I'm hoping before I die one day I will get this pen thing down here on my iPad. We'll quit making these mistakes. Okay, endochondral ossification. Endochondral literally means within cartilage, so ossification is occurring within hyaline cartilage. And what that means is basically in an embryo, most of the bones of the skeletal system are first created or synthesized as hyaline cartilage templates on which bone will develop. And as we're going to see, it's a multi-stepped process, and ossification will first occur starting in the diaphysis of the long bones, the skinny part in the middle, and then later the epiphyses will ossify. So diaphysis ossifies first, and then later your epiphyses are going to convert over to bony tissue. And we're also going to talk about a very important feature called the growth plates, which remain in place. Those are little strips of hyaline cartilage that are left over and remain in place throughout childhood and throughout adolescence until you are fully grown. So we'll talk about how all of that happens to work. Okay, so this diagram provides some of the, we're not going to get into the super gory details on endochondral ossification, but this is providing a little bit about the step-by-step process. Okay, so remember you're starting off with hyaline cartilage, and the hyaline cartilage has a connective tissue membrane surrounding it. And what happens is early on, this membrane that is surrounding the hyaline cartilage bone model or bone template that has formed in the embryo, blood vessels grow into that membrane and it converts into a periosteum. The periosteum contains these important cells that are needed for bone formation, your osteoblasts and your osteoclasts. Those osteogenic cells that become osteoblasts that we talked about on earlier lectures. All right, and then what happens is, okay, so in the center over here, in the center of what's going to be the diaphysis of the bone, you have an area in there where the chondrocytes, remember chondrocytes are the cell type in there, they enlarge and they start secreting substances that cause the matrix in there, the matrix of that hyaline cartilage tissue to ossify. It converts, well, I don't want to call it, let's don't call it ossification yet. It hardens, it calcifies. It's going to be kind of a convoluted process here for bone formation. The hyaline cartilage in there calcifies. That cuts off the diffusion of nutrients and oxygen gas to those chondrocytes in there, so they actually die. So your chondrocytes in there kill themselves, they sacrifice themselves for bone formation. And so you'll have cells that come in and digest all of that dead tissue that you have in there. So you can see the cartilage deteriorates. Now meanwhile, you've had these blood vessels that have grown into the periosteum here, this covering, and they penetrate the hyaline cartilage model and grow in there. That brings in osteoblasts and osteoclasts. And the osteoblasts, what they do is they lay down spongy bone there in the center. Okay, so you have spongy bone in the center. Then the osteoclasts, remember how we need a medullary cavity or a marrow cavity there in the center? What the osteoclasts do is, their job is to break down bone. So they carve out that medullary cavity. Remember how when we were looking at the diagrams of your typical long bone structure earlier, you've got that medullary cavity there, and It's lined, though, with a little bit of spongy bone. So some of the spongy bone is left around the edges where the medullary cavity gets carved out. Okay, meanwhile over here on, let me erase all of that. Meanwhile over here on the edges, you have osteoblasts that are laying down compact bone on the edges. Okay, and so the bone is thickening as osteoblasts that are sitting there on the edge of the bone make more and more compact bone. So they're making compact bone that forms those osteons, those long cylinder subunits we talked about, and that allows the bone to widen. Now, when you're born, about the time that you're born, the epiphyses of long bones are either still entirely hyaline cartilage, or maybe they have just started to ossify. But if they haven't started to ossify by the time you're born, shortly thereafter they will. So in the epiphyses you have what are called secondary ossification centers that develop right around the time of birth. Similar process as to what happened with over here with our primary ossification center. So the hyaline cartilage in there, same story. The chondrocytes kill themselves by having themselves calcified. The dead cartilage, the dead calcified cartilage gets carved out. Osteoblasts migrate in along with the blood supply, and spongy bone gets created in the epiphyses of the long bone. So those are called your secondary ossification centers, and then that just kind of gradually spreads out within each of your epiphyses, as they're showing you here in the diagram. Now, where do you have cartilage left over? You don't get rid of all of your hyaline cartilage. As we've already talked about, the ends of your long bones have what we call the articular cartilages. So that's a little bit of that hyaline cartilage that's left over. It stays there on the ends and becomes the gristle. And then during childhood and adolescence, you actually have a strip of hyaline cartilage right there and right there. And those are called your epiphyseal plates or your growth plates. So growth plate is another name for epiphyseal plate. So interestingly enough, that little strip of hyaline cartilage that you have between each epiphysis and the diaphysis, that is the location where growth is occurring, elongation is occurring at those locations. Because bone, once you have laid down bone, bone itself cannot expand. So bone growth always occurs either around hyaline cartilage or around the periosteum or the endosteum, those connective tissue membranes where you have your bone synthesizing cells hanging out. Once bone has formed, you don't have bone expansion within bone. It's always occurring either within hyaline cartilage, that's where you have lengthening, or you can have widening or thickening along the periosteum, that outer connective tissue covering around the diaphyses of these long bones. Okay, so postnatal bone growth after birth, the lengthening of bones can be referred to as interstitial growth because it's happening within those little hyaline cartilage strips. Remember when we talked about the skeletal cartilages on the second video lecture for this unit, we mentioned that when hyaline cartilage grows within, that is a type of interstitial growth. Appositional growth refers to increasing the thickness of bones. So that's occurring, that's the diaphysis, that's growth that's occurring over here along the edges where you have osteoblasts and osteoclasts sitting there within the periosteum covering. And that also gets into remodeling of bones, which we'll be talking about more as we move through the unit. Okay, let's talk about the growth plates and how those work. The growth plates are, or epiphyseal plates, again, that's a strip of hyaline cartilage between the epiphysis and the diaphysis at each end. And if you zoom in there, this is responsible for bone lengthening. If you zoom in there into a growth plate, so that's what you're looking at here, you're looking at a blow up of what's going on around a growth plate. And so your epiphysis is up here, diaphysis is down in here. All right, so right in here, up pretty close to the epiphysis, so up at the top portion, well, I don't want to say top because down at the other epiphysis it would be heading this way. But in the portion that's closest to the epiphysis, you have chondrocytes, cartilage cells in there that are multiplying, so they're able to undergo mitosis. Osteocytes don't do that. Bone cells, once they're surrounded by bony matrix, they don't undergo mitosis, but cartilage cells can. So you kind of see you've got these columns of chondrocytes in here. So they're dividing, which is causing the growth plate to move upward this way. So the growth plate is increasing in length this way. And then down beneath there, this is an older area in here. And down here, this is oldest. So down here in the middle, where you've got some older cells that divided much earlier, this is called the hypertrophic zone. Hypertrophy with a Y on the end refers to enlargement of cells or tissues, like your muscles, your skeletal muscles. If you exercise a lot, like you're lifting weights, they'll undergo hypertrophy. They'll increase in size. Hyper always means elevated or increased. So, and you can see that in the picture. See how the cells look bigger down in here on the diagram? They're getting bigger, and that causes, they start secreting substances that attracts calcium to come in, and so those tissues become calcified, kind of like we talked about earlier with the primary ossification center, and the secondary ossification centers. That's what has to occur first. Then those cartilage cells die. So down in here, the cartilage cells are dying. Those dead cartilage cells that were calcified, all of that tissue gets carved out. It deteriorates. And then down in here, the oldest growth plate tissues are being replaced with spongy bone. So you've got new bone formation occurring down at that level. Okay, so kind of again to review, within a growth plate, little thin strip of hyaline cartilage, and up in here, this is where you have your mitotic cells. The cells at the very top are resting. So this is where your actual lengthening is taking place. And then these are older cells that are beginning the process of having themselves calcified so that they die. And here you've got your dying cartilage tissue that gets carved out. And down in here, the oldest dead cartilage tissue has been completely carved out and replaced with spongy bone. All right, so as this calcifies down in here, you're still having more lengthening going on up in here. And so this is going to calcify, then this is going to calcify, then this is going to calcify, etc. And so basically what happens with these growth plates is the growth plate is, or the ossification down in here, the bony, the tissues that are being converted over to spongy bone are chasing the cartilage. So the cartilage keeps getting longer, and down in here it's becoming ossified. Or if you're down at the other end of the bone, at the other epiphysis, it's moving in this particular direction. But at any rate, this is what's responsible for the continued lengthening of bone. And that continues during childhood and adolescence until finally your growth plates close. All right, the growth plates will show up on an x-ray. So this is actually an x-ray from either a child or an adolescent. And so here on this x-ray, what you're looking at, maybe you're recognizing this if you've gone through the skeletal anatomy. Those are your wrist bones or the carpals. All right, and then this is the distal end of the ulna. Remember, that's also called the head of the ulna. And this is the distal end of the radius. So keep in mind the radius, the epiphysis of the radius at the distal end is actually wider than the ulna. The opposite is true up at the proximal end, at the elbow joint. The ulna, the epiphysis of the ulna is wider. The epiphysis, or the head of the radius, is narrower at that location. And then if you look right there and right there, you have a little strip that's darker on the x-ray. That's the growth plate. Because bony tissues are very dense, so they show up as white on an x-ray. Cartilage tissue is much softer. It's not nearly as dense. So the x-rays, when they're beamed through the bone, they're able to pass through that cartilage tissue, and they hit the x-ray film and they darken it. So you'll see the growth plates on an x-ray of a child or an adolescent appear dark like that. Okay, so when you growth plates very important for children and adolescents, because imagine if you one thing you have to consider is if a child or an adolescent breaks a bone, if you have a breakage across here, and the growth plate gets severely damaged. And what did we say about hyaline cartilage and its ability to heal? It's not quite as good as bone is at healing, so it'll take a while for that hyaline cartilage to wind up healing. The growth plates may not continue to elongate like they're supposed to, and so a severe injury across a growth plate in a child or an adolescent could result ultimately in that bone being shorter than what it's supposed to be once they become an adult. All right, just a little bit about some of the timing here. Ossification works pretty much on schedule, if you're developing normally as an embryo or a fetus. So it is possible to estimate fetal age pretty much if they check out x-rays and sonograms and they look at how much ossification of the skeletal system has occurred. That's one of the things that they can use to estimate embryonic and fetal age. And then by the time you're born, most of your long bones are well ossified, except for the epiphyses. You still have hyaline cartilage there. That's probably one of the things that makes babies so flexible. When a baby is first born, it's able to do things like stick its foot in its mouth pretty easily, and that flexibility is no doubt largely due to the epiphyses of the long bones still being softer hyaline cartilage. Your joints are more flexible. Okay, and there's a picture of a developing fetus you can see there where the darker colors are representing ossified skeletal tissues, and then the lighter colors are areas where you still have hyaline cartilage. So you can see now in this picture of this fetus, a lot of the skeletal system has already ossified, but you can kind of see around the joints where you have lighter color on the image, because the epiphyses of those long bones, especially here at the knee joint, you've got a lot of lighter color there because the epiphyses of those bones, the femur and the tibia and the fibula, have not yet ossified. All right, continuing on with development of the skeletal system. By the time you're age 25, ossification of your bones should be complete. And what that means is the growth plates become epiphyseal lines. All right, so if this is a long bone, there's an epiphysis and there's a diaphysis. You'll have, it can be seen on an x-ray, you'll have a little strip of bony tissue there that looks like a line, and that's the remnant of the growth plate. When the growth plate finally closes or completely ossifies, you'll have a something that you can see there on the bone that looks like a line, and that's called an epiphyseal line. All right, so growth plate closure. You may have heard of that before. Now, that just means that it has ossified. And what triggers that? You know, how does the growth plate know to stop elongating? The cartilage stops undergoing mitosis so that it can completely ossify and be converted over to spongy bone. One of the things that dictates that are the sex hormones, your testosterone in males and your estrogen in females, and estrogen triggers those growth plates to close earlier than in males. So that's why females will typically, their bones will quit elongating at an earlier age than what happens in your average male. Keep in mind that these types of things, when we're talking about gender differences, males and females, those are an average. So as you guys know, there are shorter males, there are taller females, but on average, as you know, females are going to wind up being shorter than females. All right, so about age 25, you have what we would call maximum bone density. You really have the most bone mass you're ever going to have. And then when you hit your 4th decade, your bone mass begins to decrease. Now, 4th decade, that could be kind of confusing because from the time you're born until you're 10 years old is the 1st decade. During your teens is actually your 2nd decade. Your 20s would be your 3rd decade. So this is when you're in your 30s, your bone mass begins to decrease. And as we're going to see, that you wind up with this battle going on between bone formation, creating new bone, and bone breakdown or bone resorption. And this is very important for calcium homeostasis, as we'll see. But as you get older, you're not as able to replace bone, create new bone, but yet you still got to dissolve some of your bony matrix to make sure the calcium levels stay up in your body fluid. So as you get older, you start losing your bone mass over time. The rate at which that occurs, there are a lot of different factors for that: genetics, environmental factors, things like your diet, nutrition. Do you exercise a lot? That can impact how quickly you lose your bone mass. Gender, very important. Females tend to lose their bone mass more quickly than males, especially after they reach menopause. You guys probably know that females are much more prone to developing what's called osteoporosis, which literally means bone pores. So you have a heavy breakdown of the bony tissue in some women as they get older. And again, the problem is bone resorption predominates as you get older. Bone remodeling refers to this back and forth fluctuation between creating new bone, resorbing it, or dissolving it. And that's all about calcium homeostasis, which will be the subject of some of our next lecture topics. All right, and so that's going to conclude that story about endochondral ossification and bone development after birth. And so next we will be talking more about bone growth and this remodeling process that I've been alluding to. And we'll get into calcium homeostasis because that's one of the major functions of your skeletal system as well. So we'll pick up with those topics on the next video lecture.